I opened the crescendo, see, so I cheated on you. I just cheated on you, Skylar. Because now you can push it in. None of the stops are out, but I have this crescendo, you see, that I can open up.
Push what buttons you want, I can still play.
Yeah, poor Skylar can't cancel all off for me.
We can't control you anymore.
Nope, that's right.
Unless you move the crescendo.
Takes a guy like me who's been playing since 1957. My mother was very instrumental in getting me started in music, and immediately I knew, and she knew too, that I had musical abilities, which I got from both my father, who had a wonderful tenor voice, and my mother, who did play piano, you know, enough to play primary Sunday school hymns, you know, on the piano, but very kind, very supportive, and she was the one that says, "Mark, you sit down at the piano here quite often and just sort of improvise and play little Sunday school tunes," when I think I was 5 years old. So she says, "We have to find you a piano teacher." So she was very instrumental in finding dear Anna Lundeen. Remember my dad's church, and sang in the choir too. Just lived a half a block away. And so I went over there at 6:30 on Thursday nights and had my lesson from 6:30 to 7:15. And then I went to hear Peter, Paul, and Mary at the high school auditorium one night. I think when I was maybe 6th grade, I went with some of my classmates, and they sang the Yellow Rose of Texas and the Tennessee Waltz. And I came home, and for some reason the Tennessee Waltz just really fascinated me. Da-da-da-dum, da-da-da-dum, da-da-da-da-da-da-dum, da-da-da-da-da-da-dum. And so my mother says, she said, "You sat down at the piano and you played the Tennessee Waltz, the whole thing through perfectly." She says, "I couldn't believe it." And I said, "Do you have the music?" And I said, "No." So my mother, when she went down to Champaign-Urbana, just 20 miles south, went into a music store and bought the sheet music of the Tennessee Waltz for a nickel. That was about maybe 1949 or 1950. And she came home and she says, "Play it from this musical score," which I did. And I realized that my mother was just in joy. She says, "That's exactly the way you played it, just from listening. You can play from ear. You can listen to something on the radio or live. You can just sit down and play it." And it was true. I could. It just clicked with me. She says, "You truly are going to be a musician," you know. So, and then my father did tell my 2 younger brothers and me one time, said, "Well, I would be really pleased if one of you would choose to be a pastor, follow in my footsteps," and which turned out to be my middle brother. And then he was very happy with me when I decided that I was going to be a church musician, an organist and a choir director as part of my rest of my life.
What was it that kept your interest strong?
I think, yeah, that's a good question. What kept my interest strong? I think partly because I just had musical genes that I'd gotten from mother and my father. Whereas I had my 2 younger brothers, David 4 years younger and Joel 6 years younger. They did start piano lessons with my teacher, Anna Lundeen. For some reason, I would say 75-80% that start piano early, they leave piano and they don't want to take lessons anymore after 2 or 3 years, which was true with my brothers. And yet I just wanted to continue, you know, piano lessons. I just had that drive. It was just very inspiring for me. It just became part of my life, even back as a 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th grader, I remember. But my 2 brothers, they miss that now, you know. And my brother was in the Army for a few years, and when he came home, he brought out a book that had the green grass at home, and he'd say, "I want you to sit down at the piano and play these." So he and I went into the old piano there, and he says, "You don't know how lucky you are, Mark, to be able to sit down and play some pop songs as well as classical music, you know, Bach, Beethoven, Brahms, and church hymns." He said, "You are just so lucky." But then my brother Joel would say, I think I could take piano for 30 years and never be able to play a tenth as well as you could." He said, You're just a musician." And I said, "Thank you, Joel. I guess I really feel that I am." When did organ first come into my life? It came in before I'd ever had an organ lesson. I was in 7th grade and I was still studying piano with Anna Lundeen. and I had never had an organ lesson. And it was on Maundy Thursday, which was the biggest communion service in our First Lutheran Church in Paxton. I was in 7th grade. I was 13 years old. And we had a little bit of an ice storm, a little bit of a snowstorm. And Marie Lindell had walked over to church. And so she called my father at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and he says, well, how can I help you, Mrs. Lindell? Well, I'm at the hospital. I won't be able to play tonight because I broke my arm and my right arm is in a cast. So he said, okay, I'll try to get somebody to play. So he called Mrs. Vernon Swanson, who lived in the country, pretty good assistant organist. And she said, I would be more than happy to play, but she says, I have the flu, I have 101 temperature, I have chills, I just don't dare go out tonight. So then he called my piano teacher, Anna Lundeen, and he said, both of our organists are incapacitated. Would you play the service tonight on the piano? Oh, no, she says, you can't have piano for this Holy Communion. Our membership there in Paxton was around 800 or 900, basically a farming community, but a wonderful active church. And I think Maundy Thursday and then around All Saints Day, those were the two big communion services. So I think there were maybe 600, 650 at that big communion. She said, no, you can't play piano. That's just not appropriate. So he hung up and he said, well, what do I do? So he looked at me and said, Mark, would you want to play the organ tonight? And I said, sure. I don't think even 2 seconds went by. I said, sure, I will. And I was lucky because my dad knew that I was interested in organ. And so probably from 5th and 6th grade through 7th, he asked the church council if they would approve him unlocking the organ when he went over Saturday night to get ready for communion or hang up the hymns. And they said, well, of course. So he showed me where the key was, and I would go over with him and spend an hour over there, and I'd unlock the organ, and I'd practice hymns and liturgy, and I played some of my piano pieces, some Chopin preludes on the organ, which is rather radical, but I did. And I knew the liturgy, and for Maundy Thursday, the choir anthem was God So Loved the World, which is very easy to accompany from Sir John Stainer's Crucifixion. All the hymns were typical Holy Thursday hymns that I had sung and played on the piano, and the liturgy, so I accompanied my dad on the liturgy. And so I said, sure. So I went over and practiced maybe an hour and figured out what I'd do for prelude and postlude. And I went over, our service started at 7:30, went over about 10 after 7 and opened the organ. And there were even maybe 100 people there, and they said, what's he doing? So then I went back on the steps and to the choir room, and I got my black robe on. And I played about 10 minutes of prelude, so I went out about 20 after 7, and I heard people whisper, what's he doing up there? He can't play the organ. Where's Mrs. Lindell? Why is he playing? Why is he going to play the organ? I slid on the organ bench, and I sort of pompously thought to myself, I'll show you that I know how to play the organ. So I started my prelude. I did 2 little preludes from Chopin's Opus 28. One was a little prelude in B minor, which was really easily adaptable. And then there was another E minor one, which just sounded beautiful on the organ. And then we went into the opening hymns and the liturgy and the choir anthem and 2 or 3 hymns during communion. Communion took probably at least half hour, because when my dad went over Saturday night on communion Sundays, he had to go around and individually tie the altar cloth all the way around the communion rail, which was rather huge, and he had to tie each one, by hand. And then to hang up the hymns, and he had to fill the little communion glasses with wine and make sure the wafers were out and everything was up there. So he and I, he said, Mark, you really did a good job accompanying me on the liturgy, quite a complicated liturgy in the Lutheran Church. So I was almost embarrassed. I think I had a receiving line after I finished my prelude and got off the organ bench. At least 200 people, I think, were waiting in line saying, Mark, we just amazed us. Have you ever had an organ lesson? I said, no. Wow, and you're a 7th grader? you're destined to be an organist. We wish, that you would live in Paxton the rest of your life so you could be our church organist.